So when I started this channel 6 years ago, the very first topic that I talked about in a fairly extensive video series was gun control. I covered it as comprehensively as I felt that I could at the time, issue by issue, claim by claim. Uh, I think there were 20 or 30 videos in that season, in that series, and in the 6 years since then, it's been a topic that I've returned to every year, maybe once or twice, depending on how frequently I was making videos. But it's always been in a response to some kind of event, some kind of mass shooting, or maybe a new change in the law that has prompted me to talk about it. And there's very little new to be said, though. You know, the empirical arguments, the principled arguments, the looking at the criminology, at the sociology, at the history, uh, that stuff hasn't really changed very much. And making this video after this Las Vegas shooting, which appears to be the worst of the mass shootings that have happened since I started the channel, and very likely since ever, depending on how you define a mass shooting. Um, I wasn't sure what to say because so much has already been said. Um, the empirical case for increased gun control is non-existent as far as I'm concerned. You can cherry pick. You can say, well, gun bans are effective, and here's Australia and the UK, and therefore that proves that they're effective. And that's just laughably stupid, since there are over 100 countries that have gun bans or gun restrictions that are comparable, if not more draconian than the UK and Australia, that have absolutely hideous levels of gun violence. And to simply ignore all of them by special pleading about differences in the circumstances between, say, the United States and Mexico or Brazil or South Africa or Russia, um, is to engage in rampant special pleading, since there are many differences between the US and the UK, or the US and Australia, that go beyond our gun laws. Uh, it's doubly unconvincing because in those two cases, the two cases that people are most likely to turn to, they had very low crime and very low homicide and very low gun violence before they had bans. In the case of Australia, their violent crime, their gun homicide was declining, had been declining for about 10 years prior to the ban. And once the ban was enacted, the rate of decline actually slowed, which I don't attribute to the ban necessarily, but if the trend was for it to decrease and then it decreased less, it's very difficult to give much credit to the ban. And similar in the UK, they still have mass shootings in the UK. They're not very common, but they were not very common before the ban. So to give these bans or these, and it's maybe too simple to say ban in both countries because it is legal to get firearms under certain restrictions and certain types in both of them. But it's very difficult, in fact, empirically impossible to assert that their restrictions are the cause of their low crime. You know, my favorite example would be to look at a place like Iceland. Iceland has a handgun ban, but long guns are readily available, and Iceland has basically the lowest homicide per capita in the world. It's less than one per 100,000. I think it's usually less than one person every year for the entire country, and their population is over 200,000, so it's quite low. Um, and if tomorrow they were to ban long guns in addition to handguns, and their murder rate stayed very low, it would be just completely asinine to assert, well, it's the ban on long guns that has lowered the crime. The crime was low before. We have in the United States a huge increase in the number of firearms that are owned. Uh, there are now more firearms in the United States than there are people, most likely, and it's potentially by a wide margin, although it's hard to get an exact estimate. And in the last 20 years, violent crime, including gun homicide, has declined by 40 to 50%. So very literally, the correlation is more guns equal less crime, although that's not to attribute causation. So all that has been rehashed before. I've done videos on the UK and the US and other international comparisons, and other people have done it. So what is there to talk about this time? And I think what there is to talk about is to explain to those who want more gun control. And I understand that very few of those people watch my channel, but to explain to them why there's such intransigence on this issue, why it is that people disagree with you. Because I understand that from the point of view of somebody who looks at these events and says guns have no purpose, guns are deadly killing machines, and look at the horror that they can potentially unleash, and not only potentially, occasionally actually unleash on people. How could anyone, except for some kind of cynical dogmatism or greedy corruption, oppose common sense gun restrictions? And the NRA usually figures very prominently in this. The NRA is this evil organization that is in a triangle of blood money with the gun industry, where the gun industry takes their bloody profits and gives them to the NRA, and then the NRA goes to the Congress and bribes them and with this blood money to stop any regulations, and then the fact that there's no regulations just fills profits for the gun companies, and anyone who is against new regulations are they hate children, they're cold-hearted, they want there to be blood, they enjoy it, they're cruel, all the worst character assassination that is possible. But I understand that people who favor gun control really don't get it. They really cannot fathom. And part of this is that by and large, and there are exceptions, but by and large, they don't have any firsthand experience with guns, or very minimal. There are exceptions. You do have the gun control person who was maybe in the military or who was a police officer, or the occasional hunter, but this is quite rare. For most of them, and I've talked to many who have never seen a gun that wasn't in the hands of a police officer. They certainly never touched one, they never fired one. They think that they have no purpose other than to kill, that that's what they're made for. They're created for this. But for people who do own guns, who have fired them, they understand that that's simply not true, that it's a tool, and like any tool, it can be used for good or ill, or in most cases to gather dust in the closet. They don't have volition on their own. They don't make people more violent. They have tremendous potential, but the overwhelming, statistically near total majority are never used in that way. For every bullet that's fired and enters human flesh, there are thousands and maybe even millions of bullets that are fired that strike nothing more morally significant than an empty tin can or a paper target or a stump or the ground or a sand barrier. Um, and given the staggering weight of ammunition that is used in that way relative to ammunition that is used to actually kill, it's difficult to characterize the fraction, the minuscule fraction, as not only the true purpose, but the only purpose of the firearms. They're very recreational to shoot. It's very fun to go out to the range and fire guns. They have a use, a utility, especially if you're a farmer or if you do a lot outdoors in the woods. If you have problems with feral animals, whether it's be coyotes or moles or uh, who knows, muskrats, um, they have a very, very particular role in that that's quite useful. That's a utility that goes beyond their self-defensive capabilities. But then there is the self-defensive capabilities, and it seems that people think that because the defensive use of a handgun is not going, or any gun for that matter, is not going to grab national headlines, because it won't, right? The prevention of a crime is not national news, and that's understandable, but it leads to the impression that they are not used in self-defense. But this is not something that we can only rely on the anecdotes of what the nightly news talks about. This is something that has actually been studied. Now, there is difficulties in getting estimates on how often this is used, but even the CDC, even the Brady campaign admits that the number of self-defensive gun uses in the United States per year is at least 700,000. That's the Brady campaign's number, which is the most biased low number you can find. But according to the CDC and according to Gary Kleck here, who is the criminologist at the University of Florida, who is probably the biggest authority on this, it's somewhere more like in the millions, probably 1 or 2 million, maybe as high as 3. It is difficult to estimate, but there have been many, many studies, and they narrow in on this 1 to 2 million range. Now, that's quite significant. That's quite significant when you consider the number of homicides and certainly the number who are killed in these mass shootings. And it's important to realize that that's with all types of firearms. That's with AR-15s, that's with handguns, that's with shotguns. It's also important to realize that in the overwhelming majority of those cases, nobody is killed. Most self-defense of gun uses involve brandishing only. You perceive that you're under threat, maybe you are, maybe you're not, and there almost certainly are cases where people use guns self-defensively when they weren't actually being threatened. But you brandish the firearm, and the assailant, or perhaps even the mistaken assailant, will terminate the engagement at that point. You hold out your shotgun or your handgun, and whatever ill intent they may have had is not worth getting into a gunfight with you, even if the assailant is himself armed, and the situation ends, and no one is harmed, no one is killed, and no crime takes place, which is one reason why it's so difficult to get statistics on this, because there is something, it's trying to measure something that didn't happen or that was prevented by a deterrent. But people who favor gun control, by and large, are completely ignorant of this. They don't know it. They don't understand that. They only see the mass shooting and the mass killing. And so they look at it like, oh, the only thing these items do, the only thing guns do is wreak havoc. And so their perspective is hopelessly biased in that sense. Now, the pro-gun rights people, they are very aware of the mass shootings. They know them inside and out. They probably know more details about them than do the gun control people. They get this news just like you and everyone else. They get debated about it. They get castigated for it all the time. I've never had a conversation where I revealed that I was a gun owner that did not involve some level of, at very least, friendly interrogation about this issue. So it is not something that is new or alien to me or to anyone else who interacts with other people and owns guns. They're very aware of that. So there's a reason why the gun rights people are going to kind of view the gun control people as not knowing what they're talking about, because by and large, and again, there are exceptions here, there are people who can talk policy in a way that is not biased by these lifestyle choices, but by and large they are. But there's a bigger issue here. And the issue is that the clear implication and the rhetorical end game of all gun control is mass confiscation and mass bans. The logic that is invoked to outlaw assault weapons or automatic weapons or various other types, that logic is not restricted to those types. In fact, the logic demands that there be further bans. So let's take assault weapons for now. True, these semi-automatic or potentially fully automatic or augmented semi-automatic weapons are popular among this tiny sliver of crime that is focused on creating as many casualties as possible. This is the smallest category of gun deaths that we can identify, probably. Suicide is the largest by far. 60 to 70% of all gun deaths are suicides. Among the homicides, the most common types of guns used are handguns, and then cheap shotguns, and then hunting rifles, sporting rifles, and then only after all of that, those larger categories do you come to the black rifles, the semi-automatic assault weapons. Now, these are very popular in these super high-profile shootings, but statistically, they're the least common type. And here's the problem. The logic is then that these weapons, because of their potential to kill, should be banned. That logic does not allow then for there to be handguns or shotguns or rifles either. Okay, so if we accept that argument, then there is no reason not to accept much more widespread bans. It makes no sense except as an incrementalist approach to go after 50 cals or semi-automatic rifles because they're not as widely owned as handguns or hunting rifles are. So there is a strategic tactical advantage to targeting them first, but the logic of the argument does not restrict itself to those types. It goes for all guns basically. Or here's another one. Everyone likes to bring up the UK. Everyone likes to bring up Australia. They love to cherry pick, right? They don't look at all the other countries that have gun bans or gun restrictions that have abysmal, terrible, hideous levels of violence, that have murder rates multiple times that of the United States, despite having a gun ban. No, that type of thorough statistical, empirical look at the data doesn't reach the conclusions that they would like, so they prefer to cherry pick. And while this might be a good way to goad your own ego and to, uh, you know, confirm your own biases, it's not particularly persuasive for anyone who doesn't already hold your views. But for those of you who say anything along the lines of, well, the UK has figured this out or Australia has figured this out. Well, first of all, those countries had extremely low violent crime, extremely low gun homicide, extremely low incidence of mass shootings prior to their bans. In the case of Australia, gun homicides have been dropping for 10 years prior to the ban. And they continued dropping after the ban, but at a reduced rate. It was actually dropping faster prior, which robs the ban of being able to take any kind of empirical credit for current, gun homicide rates there. And the same is true with England. England has always had much lower crime than the United States. It always had much lower gun homicide. And it passes a ban, and it still has low. So it can't really be said to have caused it. Um, but the problem here with invoking these countries is they have very wide-ranging bans, right? Not total bans. You can get guns in both countries, but they're heavily regulated, and many types are excluded that are illegal in the United States. So you'll have people who will say, you know, these gun like semi-automatics have no purpose other than um, mass killing, which is empirically and logically completely false, but they'll make that assertion. And then they'll say, I mean, England and Australia have figured this out. And then they'll ask why there's such intransigence. There's such intransigence because you've made it very clear that in your mind, there should be a UK or Australia style mass restriction, mass ban. You've made it very clear that in your mind that guns are evil killing machines that have no purpose other than to cause mass death and destruction, that they have no legitimate function in society, that they have no value, they are nothing but a blight. And then you've said, oh, but we only want to restrict the guns that are evolved in only 2 or 3% of the homicides, or maybe even less, maybe only 1%, the semi-automatic, the assault weapons. Well, that's just asinine. If that's your logic, if that's your belief, then you should go after the guns that are the largest contributors, which would be handguns, and then shotguns, and then bolt-action rifles. Those are the big ones. I think it's 88% of all the gun deaths in the United States are caused by handguns. I could be getting that wrong, and it might be old, but it's somewhere on that order of magnitude. And so someone is going to say that we have to ban the type of weapons that are only used in 1% or 2% or 3%, but they're not going to ask for 70% or 80%. And they've already said that they don't believe that guns have any legitimate purpose, that they're only there to kill. Things that every gun rights person knows to be false, knows to be objectively, demonstrably incorrect. So of course, it's blatantly obvious, and it's explicitly admitted after this last shooting in Vegas. This is what's kind of interesting and different about this one, is you have people who have, in a debate or in an attempt to pass a new regulation, will deny that they have any desire for wider ranging bans or more draconian restrictions. The rhetoric and the logic of all of their arguments lead directly to mass bans and mass confiscation, lead directly to that. And their own preferences, their own values have indicated that's where they would like it to go. They want it to be like the UK or like Australia. And that's why there's such intransigence. It's understood by the gun rights people that that's the game, that that's what you want. There are very few people out there who are going to be satisfied with a restriction on bump stocks. There's very few people out there who are going to be satisfied with an assault weapons ban like we had in 1994 with the Brady Bill. We had an assault weapons ban, and it can't be shown to have done anything. We actually had declining crime during that period, but it can't be shown to be caused by that because after the ban expired in 2004, the decline in crime continued unabated. Um, but nobody who passed that bill was satisfied. Nobody who favored that bill thought, well, this is it. We don't need any more. The people who promoted that bill the most, people like Dianne Feinstein, have said explicitly that if they could get everyone to turn them all in, they would do it. And you have all these celebrities and all of these pro gun control people who will basically admit, at least implicitly, in some cases explicitly, that that's what they want. And so of course there's going to be pushback. Why should we give up our rights for semi-automatic rifles when we know that that won't satisfy you, that you will then want something else, whether it's 50 cals or pump action shotguns or semi-automatic handguns or revolvers or whatever it is. There is no reason for us as gun rights activists to give an inch when we know that you want to take a mile. It's not just a slippery slope argument. It's not just fear mongering. That is the rhetoric. You're not going to leave it at, well, we reduce, let's say we did a ban, an actual ban on semi-automatic assault weapons. And all incidences of homicide through semi-automatic assault weapons ended, the next year. And this is totally unrealistic. It's a stupid assumption. Could never has that does not happen in the UK. They still have mass shootings in the UK, but um, let's assume that it happened. Well, that would drop the homicide rate by what, 1%, 2%, maybe 3 on the outside. That's still going to be this big number of thousands and thousands of people being killed. And so nobody who is advocating that is going to say, well, that's it, we're good enough. They're going to then argue for, well, what about all the people who are killed by handguns? What about all the people who are killed by shotguns or by hunting rifles? Do you need to hunt? And that's the other argument is they will bring out this, you don't need a gun. And they use a definition of need here that they don't apply to anything else. You don't need alcohol either. You don't need a car. You don't need a computer. You don't need a cell phone. You don't need all kinds of things that they don't go about trying to ban. You can survive without all these things. You can survive without healthcare, for Christ's sakes. Plenty of people survive without healthcare. It's definitely possible. Some people will die. Most people will live. No one bandies about the lack of need for healthcare or the lack of need for cell phones or for televisions or for computers or for vehicles or for bicycles the same way that they would say, well, you don't need a gun. And of course, those people they're horribly ignorant. They don't know what the uses of guns are. They have a phobia about them, I think, in most cases. Um, Sometimes a pathological one. I've talked to guys who are like, I shiver, I shake at the idea of somebody who's not a police officer having a gun. So when you have people who are so blatantly culturally biased, who are completely myopic in their outlook, uh, and who've made it evident that they consider guns to be the most barbaric, reductive, useless killing machines that man has ever devised, that have no place in a civil society, that have no function, that have no use, that you have no need for, then they're not going to stop at semi-automatics. And this is known by everyone. This is known by them. It's known by the gun rights people. And the gun rights people are not going to give an inch on that then. They're really not. They have no reason to. And the reason that the NRA is powerful is not because it gets blood money from gun manufacturers. It's because it has millions and millions of members, and many millions more who are sympathetic but non-members or former members, or who are members of the other gun rights organizations that tend to be much more radical than the NRA, like the Gun Owners of America, the Jews for the Preservation of Firearms Ownership, or the Pink Pistols. They're intransigent on the issue because they believe in the issue, because there's millions of people who agree with them, who will vote the way that they say. And if you live in New York or California, this is an issue you can run on, but it's a losing issue in 85% of the country. And even most Democrats are aware of that. Now, Nancy Pelosi and Elizabeth Warren, they don't need to worry. They're in safe districts. They're insulated from the mass of the interior of the country that is quite defensive about these rights, quite vocal about them, and quite willing to be activated about it. And, you know, gun rights have been doing well the last 20 years, especially the last 10 years. Uh, and they're still vigilant because the impulse to restrict them is not gone. The people out there who look at it as something that must be addressed through a UK style ban or confiscation, or Australia style UK ban or confiscation, are still out there. And that's what they want. And so when a person who wants a total ban comes and says, well, I only want to ban this one little thing, you know that it's bullshit. And you know there's no reason to give in on that one little thing. Compromise means giving them half of what they want and you getting nothing in this case. So there's going to continue to be intransigence on this issue, uh, no matter how many times this happens. And people can get out on stage and cry their crocodile tears. They bring out the same stuff before the bodies are even cold every time. None of the policies that are being bandied about right now, by the way, could plausibly have prevented what happened. None of them. Background checks, he passed a background check. You know, so it is completely a cynical attempt to use a tragedy to advance an ideological political agenda. And it's seen that way by the opponents, and that's why they don't bite. So, you know, I'm very sorry if that's what you believe. I'm sorry if you don't understand it. I'm sorry that so many of you are incapable of examining your own premises. You know, in the Facebook debates going into this, every single time I pointed out that there are dozens or hundreds of countries with gun bans that have worse violence than the United States, and that the few countries that have gun bans and low crime had low crime and low homicide prior to their bans. Not one person responded to that point. Not one person said, "Oh well, I have an explanation or I have another point." They would always pivot. They'd always go to something different. You don't want to examine your, you know, your intuition about what's right. You want to express your moral outrage and you want to think that you have a slam dunk solution, and somebody who says, well, that slam dunk is in the wrong hoop, you don't want to listen to it. And I'm sorry that we have to deal with this. And I'm sorry that, you know, every time there's a tragedy like this, before we even know what happened, we don't know what this guy's motives were. We don't know, you know, if there was something wrong with him, like was he on medication? Was he on, was he depressed? You know, was he suicidal? Was he not suicidal? Did he have an axe to grind? At this point, I don't know what any of this stuff is. I don't know that we ever will. Um, we know that none of the legislation that's being talked about would possibly have stopped this. So why is it relevant to have that discussion, right? I mean, so anyway, hopefully this is my last gun control video for a year or two until the next tragedy. But I'll talk to you all later. Bye.